Good morning, everybody. So glad to be here on this early Saturday morning. My name is Ed Samuel. I'm a career coach with a firm called Sam Nova. We are based in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and serve clients in the greater Philadelphia and across the U.S. This morning we're going to be talking about a kind of interviewing that maybe 1 out of 4 of you will experience at some point in your career. It's called behavioral-based interviewing. Sometimes people will call it competency-based interviewing, but this kind of interviewing is just very different. It's a different type of process that you're going to go through, and I kind of like to, to give people a glimpse as to what it is this morning, so that if you go on an interview and you start getting asked very different questions, that you're not caught off guard, and that you're somewhat prepared for that line of questioning. There's typically interviewing, you go for an interview and then you sit down with someone. Maybe it's your hiring manager, maybe it's an HR person, but there's this line of questioning and they ask you questions and you give them answers and it goes back and forth. It's very casual. Everybody kind of hopes that, that's the kind of interview you're walking into. Now, there's other kinds of interviews, too. There's a type of interview where the interviewer talks about themselves for 90% of the time. And in the last 5 minutes of the interview, they say, yeah, well, tell me a little about yourself. That happens more than I care to think about. And some people, go to an interview and get to be prepared for. And they're looking at your resume, and they certainly just, they take that resume and they just turn it upside down and put it on the table and say, look, I only have 2 questions. We have an hour. Why you and why us? Go. So those, there's normal back and forth. There's different variations of interviewing. But this one is called competency-based interviewing, where you're going to be asked some really specific questions. And the questioning can feel similar at some point, but what they're trying to get at with competency-based interviewing, behavioral-based interviewing, is that the employer is really trying to understand how you think. And based on your thinking and this past behavior that you used based on scenarios that you're confronted with, they believe that if they see a trend of how you think, based on those past behaviors, you're going to bring those very behaviors, those very competencies to the new job, to their firm. So this line of questioning, again, is trying to understand, why do you think the way you think? What competencies are you really trying to display when you're put in these really unique situations, so that it's a win-win. When we bring you on board, we kind of understand how you're thinking. So again, this type of interviewing is very, very different. Now, this competency-based interviewing, it could be just you and another person. It could be 2 people and yourself being interviewed, and maybe the 2 people, they split up the questions. Maybe it's a panel interview. Maybe it's 6 people, and each person on the panel will get 2 competency-based questions to ask you. It could be a recruiter. More and more recruiters, whether they be internal or even third-party search consultants, recruiters, they could be asking you a set of competency-based questions right out of the gate. And in some cases, it could be the senior executive, somebody that maybe it's the final round of interviewing. Now, believe it or not, I had a couple of clients a few years back, and both those clients were interviewing with a COO for a $100 billion company. And these interviews were 90 minutes long. And this COO for a $100 billion company spent 90 minutes, and 100% of the questioning, 100% were competency-based questions. So it was nothing like a normal interview. And we're going to go through what competency-based questions are here in a few minutes. But I want you to know that it's something that it can happen at all levels. Now, if we talked about certain behaviors, certain competencies that you have, just in terms of what you use at work, you could easily come up with no less than 60 different behaviors. And if I sat you in a room, we'd have to spend a couple of days kind of studying, how to respond to those 60 different potential questions that come at you. And it could, again, take a couple of days. I'm a big fan of just kind of honing in on maybe 10 or 15, just as a good baseline. And once you kind of understand the types of questions that are coming at you, then I think it's then I think you're going to be more than prepared. I think 60 is way too much. If you did 10, 15, I think you would be in really good shape going into an interview. Now, some firms, quite honestly, they'll actually give you a heads up. There's a pharma firm in Greater Philadelphia. When you go in for an interview, they're going to tell you, hey, this second round of interviewing, you're going to be asked competency-based questions. And they'll actually give you a list of what those behaviors are in advance and the types of questions they're going to be honing in on. And so they almost are really kind. They're giving you a heads up so you could kind of prepare. Now, unfortunately, that's fairly rare. A lot of firms won't be that kind. They're going to just kind of catch you cold and start asking you questions in fairly rapid order. So you have to be able to think on your feet. Now, I've been blessed to be certified as a competency-based interviewer. And the training was a couple of days long, and I could tell you the training was really, really intense. And if you're being interviewed by someone who's certified in competency-based interviewing, it could be a very unnerving process because their goal is to get at as many competencies as possible in the shortest amount of time. And what you'll find happening is that as you're getting these questions thrown at you and you start giving answers, you might be, 1, 2, 3 sentences in, and then that interviewer will just cut you off and say, let's move on. Right in mid-sentence. You won't even be able to finish your thought. And they're going to be pressing you to get to that next question because they're trying to get as many competencies in as you can. And you could go through an entire interview process and feel like, you've only give half the answer for all the questions that were asked. But there's a method to that madness when you're being interviewed by a certified competency-based person, depending on the system that they're using. Now, what I want to do is walk you through some examples, and what I ask that everyone think about doing is that when you give an answer for a competency-based question, I always strongly suggest that you come up with 2 very specific examples of where that competency is being used by you, and if at all possible, tie it back to your resume. So if they were poking at conflict, well, try to tie something back to your resume where you accomplished something, but there was conflict involved in that accomplishment and how you use your skills to resolve conflict, but tie it back to something that's on your resume. The other thing is that when you're giving an answer, a lot of people will promote and talk about what's known as the STAR method. And the STAR method is really the situation that you were in, the tasks that you were performing, actions that you took that then resulted in whatever you were doing. And as you're explaining that STAR, situation, task, action, results, kind of part of in explaining your story, you really want to hit on those competencies that they're really asking you to talk about. And certainly talk about the actions far more so, because the actions are the ones that they're really trying to hone in on. Now, let's go through some examples of what we're talking about when I say behavioral-based, competency-based interviews. So here's one that you could get thrown right at the beginning. So, talk to me about. This is a question, right? They're going to throw at you. Tell me about how you worked most effectively under the greatest amount of pressure. Give me an example or two about how you do that. So there's a case where they're really focusing on, can you work under pressure? And give 2 specific examples of where you can handle pressure, handle stress, and tie it back again to 1 or 2 examples on your resume. And take your time to explain a little bit about the context involved, the tasks that you and actions that you were trying to do to work through that problem, and how you were dealing with that pressure at that moment in time. Now, here's another one. Another one would be, hey, what has been your greatest, example of you taking on a challenge that was significant? And can you give me an example? So think about times where you were challenged the most and you rose to that challenge, and they want to know about how you deal with, this whole notion of being challenged, and give very specific examples. Example 1, example 2, and how you're handling that challenging situation. See, what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand, under these scenarios, what competencies are coming out, what behaviors are coming out that they want to understand during that interview. Now, here's a classic one, but a little bit different twist. Hey, what's been, a pretty big mistake that you've made? And once you made the mistake, how did you handle it? So there's another great question, not just, hey, what's been your biggest mistake, but how did you handle it? And what they're poking at is, in that answer, is what competencies are coming out, what behaviors are coming out that will show people you know how to recover from a mistake. Another one that will throw people off is, hey, tell me about a time when your integrity was challenged. Tell me about a time where somebody thought that, hey, what you were doing here doesn't make sense, and they really called you out. Is there an example or 2 that you can give where that has taken place in your career? And again, give a couple of examples, if at all possible. Another classic one is, hey, give me an example of where you had to face your greatest conflict, and how did you resolve it? And can you give me an example of where you resolved conflict and it was tied to one of your biggest projects that you were working on? So again, as they're pushing you for examples, they're trying to draw out the behaviors that were in play by you while you're dealing with and resolving conflict. Another one would be, hey, give me an example of, a really tough goal that was set that you reached, and how did you go about achieving it? Really tough goal. How did you go about achieving that goal? And again, people want to try to get an understanding of you in terms of how do you think when it comes to a goal that's thrown in front of you? What are you thinking about? How are you going about it? What's your motivation? How do you pull in your colleagues? And is it a step process that you're going through? And, what was the result? What was your attitude throughout the entire time? Did you have perseverance in achieving that goal? People want to understand, not just you did something and it resulted in something. They're trying to drill down. Walk me through how you went about achieving that goal. Tell me a little bit about how you were thinking, how you were feeling. Just another way to ask these competency-based questions. Another question that gets thrown out is, hey, you had this really great idea and you presented it. It wasn't so popular, but yet, you were asked now to go implement it. How did you do that? Give me an example of how you actually did that. Talk about, what you had to do to get the other people to support it, even though it wasn't a popular decision. And what were you feeling as you're pushing on these really difficult decisions with people? Talk to them about, how you went about it. They're trying to, again, pull out of you these behaviors that you use when you go and you do something, at work. Now, on the flip side, another question is, hey, tell me about a time that you had the best idea in the world. You presented it and it was shot down. You didn't get what you wanted. Talk to me a little bit about, how was that conversation had with your boss, with the leaders of the group, And when you were told it's a no-go, what happened? Tell me about what you were thinking. Tell me about what you said. What did you do? Just another example. Now, this next question is one that comes up almost all the time at most interviews, and it's a question that deals with, so give me a good example of where your teaming was at its highest point. In other words, where you did something where, teaming was at its best display at work. Give me an example of where you accomplished something because of how well you did teaming. That's always a classic one, and you have to be ready to give at least a couple of really good examples. And again, as you're explaining it, talk about what you're thinking, what's important to you, why do you do what you do, why do you think the way you think. A lot of times during a competency-based question, if they're trained in it, they're going to ask you, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? What was going through your mind? They'll come at you again and again with that question because they're trying to draw out of you what you were thinking, what you were actually thinking. And you want to be ready for those types of questions and give good quality answers. Another simple one is, hey, tell me about time when you just simply, you talk to somebody at work and they just simply disagree with you. In other words, we just disagree. They want to go left, you want to go right, and you're talking to that person. What happens? Tell me about what you're thinking when that takes place. How do you resolve it? Can you resolve it? Do you have to go talk to your supervisor? Can you work it out on a one-on-one basis? Is there a way that you could possibly compromise? Again, they're poking at what you're thinking, and you have to be ready for those types of answers. Now, another one that comes up every so often is, hey, tell me about a way you motivate other people around you. Give me an example of how you motivate, how you bring a level of enthusiasm to your coworkers to encourage them. Give me 2 examples of how you've done that, in the last couple of years. Well, again, they're trying to understand when you get to work, is it all just about you and the work, or do you actually try to encourage people on? And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong on a lot of these answers as much as they're just trying to understand who you are. And again, if you can tie even that answer back to something that's on your resume as an accomplishment, it's such a good thing to be able to do that. Continue to drive it back to something that resulted in a potential success on your resume. Another one is, hey, tell me about the hardest situation that you were faced with at work. And it's a very open-ended question. The hardest, most difficult situation you have ever been faced with at work. It could have been a technical challenge. It could be a manager challenge. It could be a peer challenge. It could be a problem that you were given. But you want to be ready for that type of question, because what they're poking on is, how do you deal with tough situations? Because if you come to work for us, you're also going to have tough situations. And how do you think through those situations? Now, what's interesting about these types of, and again, we could go on for an hour and I could talk about 50 more types of questions that are drawing out different competencies and behaviors. But this hopefully is giving you just a feel for the types of questions that you could be asked. And in each case, I do want you to have 2 answers ready to go. If you have more than 2, that's great, but at least have 2. And, at minimum on the ones that I'm sharing with you here on the radio this morning, because here's the thing you have to be careful of. If you only prepare one answer for each of these questions, what happens is that the interviewer could say, hey, this person sounds like that, they prepared for this a bit and they're packaging their answer a bit. And interviewers who are really smart can pick up on that. So when they turn and they look at you and say, hey, that's a really good answer. Hey, thanks for sharing that. Can you give me another example, please? And you do not want that, that deer in the headlight look, at the interviewer at that point saying, oh, shoot, let me think. And if you can't come up with one, it doesn't bode as well. You just don't want anything to be packaged as much as coming out as, hey, this is the genuine you, and this is a really good example, and let me share another example. So I always encourage people to try to have a couple of examples on these competency-based, behavioral-based type interviews. Now, let me kind of wrap things up here on a couple of fronts. Just remember, there's all kinds of interview techniques that you could be exposed to when you go in for an interview. This is just one that happens maybe 1 out of 4 times when you go in for an interview. And again, it could be on a phone screen. It could be a face-to-face. It could be with a panel. It could just be with HR. It could be just with the hiring manager. It could be with the next level of interviewing. It could be with all interviews. But I just want you to be prepared and be thinking about this because it's something that's not covered often. And when you get there, you just don't, I hate to see people get caught off guard. So again, 1 out of 4 are going to be this type of interview, whether you call it behavioral based, competency based, but it's going to be a line of questioning that will be fairly rapid order and continuous. I mentioned no matter what, have those 2 examples and then tie them back to your resume as much as possible. And if you can, use that STAR model. That STAR model in answering questions is always just a good way of answering a question. Give a little bit of the situation, the context behind what's happening, the tasks that you were performing, the actions that were being taken by you, and what you were thinking, and then it resulted in something, and that result should be what's stated on your resume. So we're just about out of time. Please join us again and on our next program on Optimize Your Career. We'll be on next on Saturday, March 16th. Our topic will be one that I get questions about all the time, and it's about recruiters and headhunters, whether they be external recruiters, internal recruiters. What do we do? What do you do when they simply never call you back? And this is about, a simple inquiry on a job that you applied for to you actually went in for an interview and the recruiters are not calling you back. It happens so much. It's amazing, but there are reasons why it happens. And I'm going to kind of explain what some of those reasons are and what, yes, you can do to try to compensate for the fact that they're not communicating with you. Some of those answers will not be the nicest answers to hear, but there are ways to work through that. And love to talk to you about, talk more about that on March 16th on our next program. So this is Ed Samuel, career coach with Sam Nova. Our website is www.samnovainc.com. If you'd like to reach me with a question or comment, email me at esamuel@samnovainc.com, or please call our main number at 610-274-8214. So make it a great weekend, and so long for now, and God bless.